The eviction notice felt satisfyingly heavy in my hands as I placed it on the marble kitchen island, the same marble my husband Victor had called wastefully expensive, until his colleagues praised it, the same home he'd asked me to leave temporarily, before moving his 27-year-old executive assistant into our bed, and the same property that was, legally, exclusively mine. A crucial detail Victor had overlooked when signing papers he never bothered to read. Too busy building his career with ideas he'd stolen from me over 15 years of marriage. Too arrogant to imagine that his supportive, sacrificing wife had been orchestrating a financial chess game that was about to cost him everything. His home, his reputation, and the company he thought he was about to lead. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The eviction notice looked official because it was official. I'd had it professionally printed on legal letterhead, complete with the gold-embossed logo of Preston & Winters, the most prestigious real estate law firm in the city. I slid it into a cream-colored envelope. Victor had always appreciated quality, stationery, and placed it in the center of the island where he couldn't miss it when he returned from his business trip to Chicago tomorrow. 36 hours. That's how long they had to vacate the property according to the notice. It wasn't legally enforceable, of course, not yet, but Victor wouldn't know that. His knowledge of property law was limited to signing documents where his attorney pointed. Documents that, for our house, had never actually included his name. I took one last look around the kitchen, mentally cataloging what I'd take and what I'd leave behind when this was over. The Italian espresso machine could stay. Victor's morning ritual had become almost religious around it. The hand-painted ceramics from our trip to Portugal would come with me. They'd been a gift from the elderly artist who'd told me they symbolized resilience and new beginnings. How prescient that had turned out to be. As I moved toward the front door, my phone buzzed with a text from Imani, my closest friend since law school, and now the managing partner at Thornfield Real Estate Investment. Group all set for tomorrow's meeting. The board is excited to meet the mysterious investor behind the Westlake acquisition. I smiled, typing back. Good. Victor's firm has no idea what's coming. What Victor also didn't know was that while he'd spent the past year climbing the corporate ladder at Holloway Development Partners, I'd been strategically investing the inheritance I'd received after my grandmother's passing. The inheritance he'd encouraged me to let him handle, and that I'd politely declined, much to his frustration. For 15 years, I'd played the role of the supportive wife. Sophia Reeves, the elegant hostess at corporate functions, the woman who remembered the names of his colleagues' children, who maintained the perfect home, who set aside her own law career to support his ambitions. What Victor had never fully grasped was that I hadn't abandoned my legal training. I'd merely redirected it. My grandmother, Isabella Martinez, hadn't just left me money. She'd left me her business acumen, her strategic mind, and her unshakable belief that a woman should always have her own resources. Men come and go, she'd told me once, but financial independence is forever. When she passed, I'd inherited not just her substantial portfolio, but also her 30% stake in a private equity firm that specialized in real estate investments. For the past 3 years, I'd been quietly building on that foundation, focusing particularly on properties in the downtown revitalization area, including the historic Wellington building, which housed the headquarters of Holloway Development Partners. Victor's company, or rather, the company where Victor was a senior partner, one step away from making named partner according to the conversations I'd overheard him having with Melissa late at night when he thought I was asleep. The irony that his affair had begun during the Wellington Tower renovation project, a project I had anonymously helped finance through my investment group, wasn't lost on me. I locked the front door of the Tudor-style home we'd purchased 7 years ago. Well, that I had purchased, with my grandmother's initial investment guidance, structuring the ownership through one of her holding companies to take advantage of certain tax benefits. Victor's name had never been on the deed, a detail handled by my attorney during a time when Victor was too busy with a major development project to attend the closing. I'd presented the paperwork later, and he'd signed without reading it carefully, assuming they were just insurance documents. That oversight would prove costly for him, but not yet. Everything had its proper timing. The unseasonably warm October afternoon embraced me as I walked to my car. The Japanese maple trees lining our driveway had turned a brilliant crimson, their color intensifying as if nature itself was acknowledging the fire that now fueled my careful plans. My phone rang just as I reached my car. Dominic, my financial advisor, and another law school friend who'd chosen a different path than practicing law. Sophia, I just got confirmation. The acquisition proposal has been formally submitted. The board meeting is scheduled for Friday morning. Perfect. Timing. Victor will be back from Chicago and settling into his new relationship crisis by then. Are you sure about this approach? Dominic asked, concerned about edging his voice. There are less confrontational ways to— I'm not interested in confrontation, I interrupted smoothly. I'm interested in restoration. Victor didn't just betray our marriage, Dom. He's been systematically taking credit for my market insights for years. Every brilliant investment strategy he's been praised for at Holloway came from our dinner conversations. The silence on the other end told me Dominic understood. He'd witnessed it firsthand at numerous industry events, how Victor would rephrase my observations as his own, how his colleagues would clap him on the back for his market instincts. The proposal is solid, Dominic finally said. Thornfield's offer is 15% above market value, and with the financing already secured, it's going to be hard for Holloway's board to refuse, especially with their recent liquidity issues. Liquidity issues I knew about because Victor had worried about them over dinner, and I had subsequently tracked through my industry connections. Liquidity issues that had shaped my investment strategy. How's the new apartment? Dominic asked, changing the subject. Perfect for my needs. Centrally located, excellent security, and the view of the waterfront gives me perspective I've been missing. I didn't add that it was in the same building where Thornfield Real Estate Investment Group had its offices, allowing me to maintain a low profile while actively directing my investments. And Victor has no idea you're behind Thornfield's acquisitions? Victor still thinks I'm staying with my sister in Phoenix, finding myself after the separation. I allowed myself a small smile. He doesn't know I've been finding much more than that. After ending the call, I drove toward downtown, the gleaming towers of the financial district rising before me like beacons. Among them, the Wellington Building stood tallest, its recent renovation, funded in part by my investment group, having transformed it from an aging office complex to the crown jewel of the city's skyline. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Inside that building, Victor's office featured floor-to-ceiling windows, with views of the river and the historic district beyond. Soon, he would look out those windows as an employee of Thornfield Real Estate, not as a soon-to-be-named partner at Holloway. I parked in the private garage beneath my apartment building, using the secure elevator that required both a key card and fingerprint authentication. The system recognized me immediately. Ms. Martinez, it displayed, using my grandmother's surname, which I'd legally readopted 3 months ago without Victor's knowledge. The elevator rose smoothly to the penthouse level, opening directly into a minimalist foyer that led to my private office suite. Unlike the traditional, somewhat stuffy decor of my Tudor home, this space was all clean lines and open concept design, with walls of glass that brought the cityscape inside. Imani was waiting for me, impeccable as always in a charcoal pencil skirt and crimson blouse, tablet in hand. Perfect timing, she said, rising from the sleek conference table where she'd been reviewing documents. Lawrence just sent over the final acquisition papers for your review. Lawrence Chen had been my attorney since my grandmother's passing, helping me navigate the complexities of her estate and subsequent investments. He was also, conveniently, an expert in corporate acquisitions and property law. "Any changes from the draft I approved yesterday?" I asked, accepting the tablet she handed me. "Minor clarifications on the retention package language for key Holloway employees. Nothing substantive." Imani's perfectly manicured finger swiped to the highlighted section. "The board won't be informed of the true ownership structure until after the initial agreement is signed." I nodded, scanning the document. "And the Wellington building lease terms?" "Set to triple for all current tenants once the acquisition is complete, with one exception." Imani allowed herself a rare smile. "The Thornfield subsidiary will maintain favorable terms for any tenant willing to sign our ethics code and compliance agreement." An agreement that specifically prohibited the behaviors Victor had displayed throughout our marriage: taking credit for others' work, manipulating financial information, engaging in office relationships with direct reports. It wasn't revenge, I reminded myself. It was accountability. "The timing works perfectly with Victor's return from Chicago," I noted, handing the tablet back to Imani. "He'll be walking into multiple crises simultaneously." "Speaking of timing," Imani said, checking her watch, "the investors' call starts in 20 minutes. Are you ready to brief them on the Holloway acquisition strategy?" For the next hour, I led a conference call with Thornfield's major investors, outlining our approach to the Holloway acquisition without revealing my personal connection to the target company. The investors were primarily interested in the financial projections, which were undeniably strong. The post-acquisition restructuring would yield significant returns, particularly once we implemented the new management approach I'd been developing, one that emphasized ethical leadership and proper attribution of intellectual contributions. After the call, Imani lingered, studying me with the careful assessment of someone who'd known me for 2 decades. "You seem calmer than I expected, given what tomorrow will bring." I considered this as I poured us each a glass of water from the carafe on the conference table. "I'm not operating from emotion, Imani. This isn't about hurting Victor or even punishing him. It's about correct alignment of consequences. And the house? The eviction notice? A necessary catalyst." I took a measured sip of water. "Victor needs to understand that actions have repercussions, professionally and personally." We spent another hour reviewing the details for tomorrow's board presentation before Imani departed, promising to arrive early to finalize our approach. Alone in my apartment, I moved to the wall of windows that showcased the city and the river beyond, lights beginning to twinkle as dusk settled. Somewhere across that river, in our Tudor home, Victor and Melissa were perhaps enjoying dinner, making plans for their future in a house that had never been his to offer. Tomorrow, that illusion would begin to crumble, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the methodical application of facts and legal realities. My phone chimed with an incoming email, a final confirmation from Lawrence that the documents had been courier-delivered to Holloway's board members for review before tomorrow's meeting. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. I opened my laptop to review my presentation for tomorrow one last time. On my screen, the Thornfield logo, a stylized phoenix rising, seemed particularly appropriate. From the ashes of my marriage, I wasn't just surviving, I was reclaiming the professional identity and market insights Victor had systematically co-opted throughout our 15 years together. Tomorrow, the carefully constructed facade Victor had built would begin to crumble, not with a dramatic crash, but with the precise dismantling that comes from systematic preparation. The eviction notice was just the first tremor in what would become a seismic shift in Victor's reality. I closed my laptop, feeling not the vindictive satisfaction Victor might have expected, but the calm certainty of someone who had methodically prepared for this moment. For years, he had seen me as an accessory to his success story, the supportive wife who had sacrificed her own ambitions for his. He had never truly recognized the strategic mind that had shaped his career from behind the scenes. Tomorrow, that will change. And unlike Victor, I had left nothing to chance. The exact moment I discovered Victor's betrayal is etched in my memory with painful clarity. It wasn't the lipstick on his collar or a suspicious text message. Those would have been almost quaint in their predictability. Instead, it was a quarterly investment report that revealed the truth. 3 months ago, I sat at my grandmother's antique writing desk in our home office, reviewing Thornfield's latest acquisition portfolio. As Isabella Martinez's heir and a silent partner in the firm, I maintained regular oversight of our investments, though few people knew of my involvement. Victor certainly didn't. He'd always dismissed my interest in finance as a cute hobby, rather than the strategic career I'd built in parallel to supporting him. The Wellington Building renovation project had been proceeding on schedule, and I was examining the updated projections when I noticed an unusual expense allocation. Someone had authorized an additional $300,000 for executive office customizations that hadn't been in the original budget. Not a significant amount in the context of the overall project, but unusual enough to flag my attention. I accessed the detailed expense reports through Thornfield's secure portal. The customizations were for the Holloway Development Partners Executive Suite, specifically 2 adjacent offices on the 38th floor. Victor's office and a newly created space for his executive assistant. A quick search revealed requisition forms signed by Victor, including detailed specifications for connecting doors between the offices and custom furniture for both spaces. The forms included the assistant's name, Melissa Winters, age 27, hired 6 months prior. I'd met Melissa exactly twice at company functions. She was attractive in that polished, ambitious way that seemed manufactured specifically for corporate success. Sleek bob, designer clothing that walked the fine line between professional and attention-seeking, a master's degree in business. Mentioned within the first 5 minutes of conversation. Victor had introduced her with the practiced pride of someone showing off a particularly strategic acquisition. Melissa graduated top of her class at Wharton, he'd said, his hand lingering just a moment too long on her shoulder. I'd thought nothing of it at the time. Now, staring at furniture requisitions that included a custom sofa described as suitable for extended work sessions. I felt the first tremor of what would become a seismic shift in my understanding of my marriage. I didn't confront him immediately. Instead, I did what my grandmother had taught me. I gathered information methodically, dispassionately, building a complete picture before taking action. The next morning, I called Imani under the pretense of meeting for our regular lunch. In reality, I needed access to Thornfield's security protocols for the Wellington building. The new systems are impressive, Imani explained as we sat in her office, reviewing the building's security features. Keycard access for all floors, but executive levels required dual authentication, biometric plus code. And the data logs? I asked, keeping my tone casual. Stored securely for 90 days. Part of our insurance requirements. She gave me a curious look. Why the sudden interest in security protocols? Just being thorough, I replied. Grandmother always said details matter. That evening, I accessed the security logs through Thornfield's executive portal, using the credentials I rarely employed. The data revealed a pattern that confirmed my suspicions. Victor and Melissa entering the building, together early, leaving late, weekend access when no other executives were present. The connecting door between their offices activates multiple times daily. Still, this was circumstantial. Damning, but circumstantial. The definitive evidence came from Victor's own carelessness. He'd left his laptop open one evening after falling asleep on the couch, his password manager automatically filling in credentials for his personal email. I found hundreds of messages between him and Melissa, dating back nearly 5 months. The content progressed from professional to flirtatious to explicitly intimate, culminating in discussions of their future together. Once the Wellington project is complete and I am named partner, everything changes, he'd written. Sophia has been useful, but she's part of my past. You're my future. Useful. 15 years of marriage, reduced to utility. There were financial discussions as well. Plans. To use his expected partnership bonus to buy out what he assumed was his half of our house. Mentions of my grandmother's inheritance, which he incorrectly believed would be considered marital property in a divorce. Her grandmother's money will secure our future, he'd written to Melissa. She doesn't have the financial sense to protect it properly in a divorce. That was the moment everything crystallized for me. Not the affair itself. People fall in and out of love, a painful but human reality. It was the calculated assessment of me as an asset to be managed, exploited, and discarded. The casual dismissal of my intelligence and capabilities. The assumption that I would be easily manipulated during our dissolution. I closed his laptop, without confronting him. Instead, I began making calls the next morning. To Lawrence Chen, to update my estate planning. To the private bank where my grandmother's holdings were managed, to ensure all accounts were properly secured. To a real estate agent, to find a suitable apartment in the downtown district. Within a week, I had implemented the first phase of what would become a comprehensive strategy. I legally readopted my grandmother's surname, Martinez, for all financial dealings while maintaining Reeves for social interactions. I transferred ownership of our home from my holding company to a different entity, reinforcing the legal firewall between Victor and the property. I secured the downtown apartment, paying a year's lease in advance. All of this occurred while maintaining the facade of our marriage. I prepared Victor's favorite meals, attended his company functions, listened to his strategies for the Wellington project, strategies I now recognized as ideas I had casually suggested during our conversations, repackaged as his own insights. The breaking point came 3 weeks later, over dinner at La Maison, the French restaurant where Victor had proposed 15 years earlier. I had suspected he might be planning to ask for a divorce in this public setting, calculating that I wouldn't make a scene. Instead, he delivered something far more insulting. "Sophia?" he began, reaching for my hand across the table. "I've been thinking about our future." I allowed him to take my hand, noting the practiced sincerity in his expression, the same look he used when pitching to hesitant investors. "We've been growing apart," he continued. "My career is entering a critical phase, and I need to focus completely on the Wellington project and the partnership decision." I nodded, waiting. "I think we need some time apart. A temporary separation while I navigate these next few months." His thumb stroked the back of my hand. "It would be easier if you could stay with your sister in Phoenix for a while. The house has my home office, and with the hours I'm putting in, you want me to leave our home so you can focus on work?" I clarified, my tone neutral. "Just temporarily. 4 months, maybe 6. Once I secure the partnership, we can reassess." He squeezed my hand. "I'll cover all your expenses, of course." The absolute confidence with which he delivered this proposal, as though it were a generous offer rather than a transparent maneuver to install his mistress in our home, was almost admirable in its audacity. "And this has nothing to do with Melissa Winters?" I asked quietly. A flicker of surprise crossed his face before his expression smoothed over. "Melissa, my assistant? This is about my career, Sophia, not some office gossip." I didn't press further. There was no point in confrontation, not when I had already set my plans in motion. Instead, I nodded slowly, as though considering his proposal. "I understand," I said finally. "Your career has always been our priority." The relief that washed over his face was palpable. He had expected resistance, perhaps tears or accusations. My acquiescence threw him momentarily off balance. "I appreciate your understanding," he said, signaling for the check. "This is what's best for both of us right now." "When were you thinking I should leave?" I asked, my tone suggesting practical consideration rather than emotional resistance. "Is next week too soon?" "The Wellington presentation to the board is coming up, and I need to prepare without distractions. Distractions. 15 years reduced to a distraction. Next week is fine, I agreed. I'll pack what I need and make arrangements with Claire. My sister, who lived in Phoenix, would indeed be surprised by this development, not because of Victor's betrayal, which she had long suspected, but because of my apparent compliance. The following week was a masterclass in strategic preparation, disguised as a hasty departure. I carefully selected which personal items to take to my already furnished downtown apartment, focusing on irreplaceable mementos and documents. I transferred the remaining contents of my private safe to a secure deposit box at my bank. I meticulously documented the house's contents, particularly the art and antiques that had come from my grandmother's estate. Victor, interpreting my efficiency as eagerness to comply with his wishes, became increasingly solicitous, even helping me pack certain items. His transparent relief at my cooperation might have been hurtful if I hadn't been so focused on the broader strategy unfolding. On my last day in the house, he insisted on helping me load my car, carrying boxes with an almost boyish enthusiasm that bordered on insulting. "I've transferred money to your personal account," he said as I prepared to leave. "Enough for 6 months, though I hope we can resolve things before then." "That's generous," I replied, knowing I wouldn't touch those funds. The amount he considered substantial was less than what I typically allocated for quarterly charitable donations through my grandmother's foundation. "And Sophia," he added as I got into my car, "I really do care about you. This is just a necessary step for both of us." I looked at him standing in the driveway of the home that legally belonged solely to me, a home he was planning to share with his mistress within days, and felt something unexpected. Not anger or hurt, but a curious sense of clarity. In that moment, I saw Victor completely, not the successful, brilliant strategist he presented to the world, but a man so convinced of his own narrative that he couldn't conceive of existing as a secondary character in someone else's. "Goodbye, Victor," I said simply, and drove away. I didn't go to Phoenix. Instead, I moved into my downtown apartment, 14 floors directly above Thornfield's offices. The same afternoon, I met with Lawrence Chen to formalize the next phase of my strategy. "The house is securely in your holding company's name," Lawrence confirmed, reviewing the documentation. "Victor has no legal claim, though he clearly believes otherwise." "And the Thornfield acquisition of Holloway?" I asked. "Progressing, according to schedule. The initial approach has been made through intermediaries. Holloway's board doesn't yet know Thornfield is the interested party." Lawrence adjusted his glasses. "Your name appears nowhere in the documentation. As far as anyone at Holloway knows, Thornfield is simply a competitive investment firm making a strategic acquisition." I nodded, satisfied. "And the Wellington building lease?" "The corporate lease agreements include the escalation clause we discussed, triggered by a change in building ownership. Once Thornfield acquires Holloway, all tenants will face the option of signing the new terms or relocating." Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The pieces were in place for both Victor's professional recalibration and his personal awakening. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly he would move Melissa into our home. I had expected perhaps a month of discretion, a reasonable buffer between my departure and her arrival. Instead, it took exactly 16 days. I knew this with precision because the house's security system, which Victor had never bothered to learn how to fully operate, sent alerts to my phone whenever new entry codes were programmed. On the evening of the 16th day after my departure, a new code was created. 20 minutes later, external cameras captured Victor helping Melissa unload suitcases from her car, laughing as he carried them through the front door with the proprietary confidence of a man sharing his domain. The emotional blow I might have felt was eclipsed by the cool recognition of an opportunity. Victor had accelerated the timeline, creating the perfect conditions for the next phase of my strategy. His overconfidence, moving his mistress into a house he didn't own while still legally married, demonstrated a recklessness that would serve my purposes. I immediately contacted Lawrence to prepare the eviction notice, not as an impulsive reaction, but as a calculated next step in the broader strategy. The notice would arrive precisely as Victor returned from his Chicago trip. The same day Thornfield would formally reveal itself as the entity acquiring Holloway Development Partners. That evening, as I reviewed the final acquisition documents, with Imani, my phone displayed a social media notification. Melissa had posted a picture on her Instagram account, a selfie in front of our fireplace captioned, "Home sweet home, new beginnings with the love of my life." The geotag showed our address. In the background, visible on the mantel, was a photograph of my grandmother, the matriarch whose financial acumen had made possible everything that was about to unfold. "Is that—" Imani began, looking over my shoulder at the image. "Yes," I confirmed. "They've made themselves quite at home." "Does that bother you?" she asked carefully. I considered the question seriously. "Not in the way Victor would expect," I finally replied. "It bothers me as a miscalculation bothers a chess player. They've moved exactly where I anticipated, just sooner than expected. And that accelerates our timeline?" "It creates perfect synchronicity," I corrected. "The eviction notice will arrive the same day as the Thornfield acquisition announcement. Victor will face both professional uncertainty and personal displacement simultaneously." "You've thought of everything," Imani observed. "Not everything," I admitted. "I didn't expect such immediate disregard for basic discretion. It's almost disappointing." What I didn't articulate, even to Imani, was the subtle sting beneath my strategic calculations. Not jealousy, but a kind of retrospective clarity. Had Victor always been this careless, this transparent in his ambitions? Had I simply chosen not to see it during our 15 years together? That night, standing at my apartment windows overlooking the city, I watched the lights of the financial district where Victor's career was centered. Tomorrow, those lights would still shine, but the power dynamics they represented would shift, fundamentally. Not through dramatic confrontation or emotional appeals, but through the methodical application of legal and financial leverage I had spent months assembling. Victor had always underestimated me, viewing my intelligence as an attractive accessory to his success rather than an independent force. Tomorrow, that misconception would begin its systematic correction. I touched the glass, my reflection superimposed over the city lights. Sophia Martinez-Reeves, no longer the supportive wife existing in the background of Victor's narrative, but the architect of a reclamation that would reverberate through the city's financial district. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of Victor's education in consequences. And unlike the lessons he had delivered throughout our marriage, mine would be thorough, methodical, and impossible to misinterpret. The morning Victor was scheduled to return from Chicago dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that seemed cinematically appropriate. I had deliberately chosen this day for both the eviction notice and the Thornfield acquisition announcement, not from a sense of dramatic flair, but because timing in business, as in chess, is everything. I dressed with particular care, a charcoal, gray suit that conveyed authority without ostentation, paired with a single piece of my grandmother's jewelry, a platinum pendant containing a small emerald, her birthstone. Nothing flashy or attention-seeking, just quiet confidence and the subtle connection to my family legacy that had always been my true source of strength. "The board members have all arrived," Imani reported when I entered the Thornfield conference room on the 40th floor. "They've been provided the preliminary documents, but haven't been informed of the identity of the primary investor yet." "Perfect," I replied, setting my portfolio on the polished table. "And the Holloway representatives?" "Scheduled to join via video conference at 10. Victor's flight landed an hour ago, according to the tracker. He should be at his office in time for the call." I nodded, mentally visualizing the sequence of events about to unfold. By now, Victor would be on his way home first. he always stopped at the house to shower and change after overnight flights before heading to the office, which meant he would encounter the eviction notice approximately 90 minutes before learning about the Thornfield acquisition. "Our legal team is standing by," Lawrence Chen added, entering with several folders. "Both for the property matter and the acquisition. Everything is proceeding according to schedule." At precisely 8:30 a.m., my phone received an alert from the house security system. The front door had been opened using Victor's entry code. I imagined him walking into the kitchen, finding the cream-colored envelope centered on the island. I could picture his expression shifting from post-trip fatigue to confusion to disbelief as he read the formal language of the eviction notice. 3 minutes later, my phone rang. Victor's name appeared on the screen. I declined the call, sending it to voicemail. He called again immediately. Again, I declined. This pattern repeated 4 more times before a text message appeared. "What the hell is this eviction notice? Is this some kind of joke?" I didn't respond. Reaction without information was a weakness Victor had often exhibited, responding emotionally before gathering complete facts. It was a tendency I had counted on. Another text followed. "Sophia, this isn't funny. Call me immediately. And then, if this is about Melissa, we can discuss it like adults. You can't just evict me from our home. Our home." The presumption of shared ownership when he had never bothered to verify the legal reality. This, too, I had anticipated. At 9:15 a.m., the Thornfield executive team gathered for our final preparation before the Holloway video conference. The acquisition proposal was comprehensive. A purchase price 15% above market value, retention packages for key employees, excluding senior leadership, and a complete restructuring of the executive suite once the transaction was completed. Holloway's board is eager for this deal given their liquidity concerns, Dominic explained, reviewing the financial projections. But they're unaware of how those concerns were manufactured. What Dominic was referencing was perhaps the most subtle aspect of my strategy. Over the past 6 months, Thornfield had systematically approached several of Holloway's major clients, offering more competitive terms on their development projects. These clients hadn't abandoned Holloway outright. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they had delayed contract renewals and project expansions, creating the liquidity pressure that now made Thornfield's acquisition offer so attractive. "And their reaction when they discover the identity of Thornfield's primary investor?" Lawrence asked. "By then, the preliminary agreement will be signed," I replied calmly. "The revelation of my involvement comes only after they're contractually committed." At 9:45, my phone displayed another text from Victor. "I just spoke with my attorney. He says this eviction notice can't possibly be legal. We're married. It's our house." I allowed myself a small smile. Victor's attorney, Bradley Wilson, was competent in corporate law, but notoriously uninformed on property matters. He would have given this reassurance without verifying the actual ownership structure of the house. Another text followed. "I'm heading to the office for an emergency board meeting, but this isn't over. We'll discuss when I get home tonight." Our home. The confidence in his messages confirmed he hadn't yet investigated the property records, which would clearly show the house had never been in his name. Another oversight born of the same arrogance that had characterized so many of his professional decisions. At precisely 10 a.m., the video conference with Holloway's board began. I remained out of camera range, observing as Imani led the initial discussions with Dominic providing financial details. The Holloway board members appeared both intrigued by the generous offer and unsettled by the unexpected approach. "While we appreciate Thornfield's interest," Gerald Blackwell, Holloway's board chair, said carefully, "we're curious about the timing of this offer. Our company isn't publicly for sale." "The best acquisitions rarely are," Imani replied smoothly. Thornfield has identified significant synergies between our investment approach and Holloway's development expertise. Our offer reflects that potential value. I watched the screen carefully, noting the moment Victor entered Holloway's conference room, his normally impeccable appearance slightly disheveled. He took a seat slightly apart from the other board members, his expression tense. I wondered if he had shared the eviction notice situation with his colleagues, or was attempting to compartmentalize his personal crisis. Before we proceed further, Gerald continued, we'd like to understand more about Thornfield's ownership structure. Who exactly would be acquiring Holloway? This was the moment we had carefully choreographed. Imani glanced toward me, receiving my slight nod. Thornfield would be happy to introduce our primary investor, she said, gesturing for me to join her on camera. I moved into frame, taking the seat beside Imani with practiced composure. The reaction from Holloway's conference room was immediate, several board members leaning forward in surprise, Gerald's eyebrows rising in recognition. And Victor, his face draining of color as the professional crisis he was facing suddenly collided with the personal one he had discovered an hour earlier. Good morning, I said calmly. For those who don't know me, I'm Sophia Martinez, primary investor and strategic director at Thornfield Real Estate Investment Group. Martinez? Gerald repeated, clearly recognizing my grandmother's name but confused by the discrepancy from how he knew me. Are you related to Isabella Martinez, her granddaughter and heir? I confirmed. Though some of you may know me by my married name, Reeves. All eyes in the Holloway conference room turned to Victor, whose expression had transformed from shock to a dawning comprehension that was almost painful to witness. Ms. Martinez has been the driving force behind Thornfield's recent acquisitions, Imani continued smoothly, including our interest in Holloway Development Partners. We weren't aware of this connection, Gerald managed, clearly struggling to maintain professional composure while processing this revelation. My investment? Activities have always been conducted independently of my personal relationships, I stated, my tone measured. Thornfield's interest in Holloway is purely strategic, based on market analysis and growth potential. Victor finally found his voice. This is highly inappropriate, he said, his tone strained. There's an obvious conflict of interest given our personal situation. On the contrary, Lawrence Chen interjected, stepping into frame beside me. Ms. Martinez's investment activities predated any personal developments between you. All actions have been conducted with proper legal and ethical boundaries, as our documentation clearly demonstrates. I maintained direct eye contact with Victor through the video feed, watching as he struggled to reconcile the composed, strategic businesswoman before him with the supportive wife he had so thoroughly underestimated. Perhaps we should pause these discussions, Gerald suggested, clearly sensing the tension. It seems there are personal factors to consider. Business shouldn't wait for personal matters to resolve, I countered calmly. Our offer has a 48-hour window for preliminary acceptance. After that, both the premium pricing and retention packages may need reconsideration. The implicit pressure wasn't lost on Holloway's board. Several members exchanged concerned glances, their liquidity issues clearly weighing on their minds. We'll need to discuss privately, Gerald finally said. Can we reconvene at 3 this afternoon? Of course, Imani agreed. We'll send additional documentation for your review in the meantime. As the video conference ended, I remained seated, anticipating the immediate aftermath. Sure enough, my phone began ringing seconds later. Victor again. This time, I answered. Sophia, he began, his voice a mixture of anger and disbelief. What the hell are you doing? Business, I replied simply. Both the eviction notice and the acquisition offer are straightforward matters. Straightforward? You're trying to take over my company and kick me out of our home in the same day. This is vindictive, and you know it. It's neither vindictive nor personal, I countered. The house has always been solely in my name. something you would have known had you ever read the documents you signed. And Thornfield's interest in Holloway is based on sound investment principles, not personal considerations. "This is about Melissa," he accused, his voice rising. "You found out about us and now you're retaliating." "Melissa is welcome to leave the property with you," I said evenly. "The eviction applies to both unauthorized occupants." "Unauthorized?" He stopped, and I could almost see him struggling to process the implications. "You can't possibly own the house outright. I've been paying the mortgage for years." "You've been paying me rent, essentially," I corrected. "The house was purchased through my grandmother's holding company with no mortgage. The monthly payments you've made have gone into an account that funded the property taxes and maintenance. All perfectly documented." The silence that followed held a weight I could almost physically feel through the phone. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice quieter. "Why the elaborate deception? If you had this kind of money, these connections, why pretend otherwise all these years?" It was a revealing question, one that demonstrated how completely he had misunderstood. Not just our financial arrangement, but my fundamental character. "I never deceived you, Victor," I replied. "I simply managed my inheritance according to my grandmother's guidance. You never asked about the specifics because you assumed I had handed control to you. That assumption was yours, not a deception on my part. And Thornfield? The acquisition? That's not deception. That's business," I repeated. "Thornfield has identified Holloway as an undervalued asset with potential under proper management. The offer is more than fair." "This isn't over," he said, anger returning to his voice. "You can't just dismantle my life like this." "I'm not dismantling anything, Victor. I'm simply allowing consequences to unfold naturally. You made certain choices, professionally and personally. Those choices have outcomes." I ended the call before he could respond, turning to find Imani, Dominic, and Lawrence watching me with varying expressions of respect and concern. "He'll try to fight both the eviction and the acquisition," Lawrence noted. "With limited success on either front," I replied. "The property records are clear, and the acquisition doesn't require his approval, only the board's." "Speaking of the board," Dominic interjected, "our sources indicate they're already in emergency session discussing the offer. The liquidity pressure is significant enough that several members are advocating immediate acceptance." I nodded, unsurprised. "And the media?" "Financial news outlets have picked up rumors of the potential acquisition," Imani confirmed. "But no details about your involvement have leaked yet. That will change after the preliminary agreement is signed," I acknowledged. "We should prepare for the public narrative." For the next 2 hours, we refined our approach for the afternoon meeting with Holloway's board. Market analysts were already speculating about the potential acquisition, causing Holloway's stock to rise 7% on the rumors alone. Our offer, already generous at a 15% premium, was becoming even more attractive as the market reacted. At noon, I received an unexpected call from Gerald Blackwell, Holloway's board chair. "Ms. Martinez," he began formally, "I'm calling outside official channels to gain some clarity on the situation." "I appreciate your directness," I replied, signaling to Imani and Lawrence to join me for the call. "The board is obviously considering your offer seriously," he continued. "However, some members have expressed concern about the personal elements potentially influencing business decisions." "A valid consideration," I acknowledged. "Which is why I've maintained complete separation between personal matters and investment strategy. The documentation we provided demonstrates that Thornfield's interest in Holloway predates any personal developments between Victor and myself." "That may be technically true," Gerald said carefully, "but the timing of today's events seems coordinated. Business opportunities often align in unexpected ways," I offered. "The substance of the offer should be evaluated on its merits, regardless of timing." There was a brief pause before Gerald spoke again, his tone shifting slightly. Off the record, Sophia. I've known you for what, 12 years? Through all those Holloway functions. Always thoughtful, always observant. I never realized you were Isabella Martinez's granddaughter. Few people made the connection, I replied. My grandmother valued privacy in her business dealings. She was a formidable woman, he acknowledged. I negotiated against her twice in the 90s, lost both times. Another pause. The board will likely accept your preliminary offer this afternoon. Victor is being excluded from the vote due to obvious conflicts. This was valuable intelligence, confirming my strategy was proceeding as planned. I appreciate your candor, Gerald. Don't mistake it for alliance, he cautioned. I'm acting in Holloway's best interests, which currently align with accepting Thornfield's offer given our liquidity situation. But I'm curious about your endgame. Here. My endgame is straightforward, I replied. Thornfield acquires Holloway, restructures its management approach, and implements a more sustainable growth strategy that doesn't rely on claiming credit for other people's contributions. The pointed nature of my final phrase wasn't lost on Gerald, whose silence suggested he recognized exactly what I was referencing. Victor's habit of appropriating others' ideas hadn't been limited to mine during our marriage. I see, he finally said. Well, we'll present our formal response at 3. After ending the call, I turned to Imani and Lawrence. They're going to accept. That was faster than projected, Imani noted. We expected at least the appearance of negotiation. Their liquidity concerns are more pressing than we realized, I explained. And Gerald knows the offer is more than fair. I paused, considering. He also knows Victor well enough to recognize the pattern I referenced. Speaking of Victor, Lawrence interjected, checking his phone, my sources indicate he's consulted 3 different attorneys in the past 2 hours. One for the eviction matter, one for the acquisition, and one for personal asset protection. He's realizing the extent of his exposure, I observed, both professionally and financially. Should we be concerned about potential countermoves? Dominic asked, joining us with updated financial projections. We should be prepared for them, I corrected. But Victor's options are limited. The house ownership is unambiguous. The acquisition requires only board approval, not his. His primary leverage would be personal, attempting to paint me as vindictive or emotionally unstable, which the documentation directly contradicts, Lawrence noted. The timing may seem personal, but the substance of both actions is thoroughly justified by business and legal principles. At 2:30, we gathered again in the Thornfield conference room, preparing for the follow-up meeting with Holloway's board. My phone displayed 6 missed calls from Victor and a series of increasingly agitated text messages, which I archived without responding. His emotional reaction was both predictable and irrelevant to the proceedings at hand. Holloway's stock is up 9% now, Dominic reported. The market clearly expects the acquisition to proceed. I nodded, watching the financial data scroll across the screens. Everything was unfolding with the precise, inexorable logic that governed all well-executed business strategies. Not personal vengeance, not emotional reaction, but the systematic application of leverage and opportunity. As we waited for the video conference to reconnect, I found myself reflecting on a conversation with my grandmother years earlier, shortly after I had begun dating Victor. He's ambitious, she had observed after meeting him for the first time. Ambitious men can achieve great things, but they rarely notice the scaffolding that supports their climb. At the time, I had defended Victor, insisting he valued me as a partner, not scaffolding. Now, 15 years later, as I prepared to acquire his company while reclaiming my home, I recognized the prescience in her assessment. Victor had climbed, using ideas and support from those around him, never looking down to acknowledge the structure that made his ascent possible. Today, that scaffolding wasn't just being acknowledged. It was systematically being reclaimed piece by methodical piece. The afternoon video conference with Holloway's board proceeded exactly as Gerald had indicated it would. With minimal deliberation, they voted to accept Thornfield's preliminary acquisition offer, pending due diligence and final terms negotiation. Victor was notably absent from the call, excluded from the vote due to his conflict of interest, according to Gerald. "We anticipate a smooth transition," Gerald assured us, his businesslike tone belying the unusual circumstances. "Our legal team will coordinate with yours on the due diligence process starting tomorrow." "Excellent," Imani responded. "Thornfield is prepared to expedite the process to minimize market uncertainty." As the call concluded, Lawrence passed me a handwritten note. "Victor is in the lobby, demanding to come up." I considered this development, briefly before nodding to Lawrence. "Have security escort him to the small conference room on 38. I'll meet him there." "Are you sure that's wise?" Dominic asked after the video connection ended. "He's likely emotional and unpredictable right now, which is precisely why I'll meet him in a controlled environment," I replied, gathering my materials. "His emotional state makes this the perfect opportunity to assess exactly what he knows and what he plans to do." "I'll have security present," Lawrence said, already texting instructions. "Not inside the room," I countered. "That would signal I fear him, which I don't. Just outside, within call if needed." 15 minutes later, I entered the small conference room on the 38th floor to find Victor pacing, his usually immaculate appearance noticeably disheveled. He turned as I entered, anger and bewilderment battling for dominance in his expression. 15 years, he said without preamble. 15 years of marriage, and I never knew you at all, did I? I set my portfolio on the table between us, maintaining a professional distance. "You knew exactly who I was, Victor. You simply chose to see only the parts that served your narrative." Narrative? He almost laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Is that what this is about? You feel I didn't appreciate your contributions enough, so you orchestrate this elaborate takeover?" "This isn't about appreciation," I corrected him calmly. "It's about consequences. You made certain choices, professionally, and personally, those choices have outcomes. Like using your grandmother's money to take over my company and steal our home? First, it wasn't our home legally, a fact you could have discovered at any point had you bothered to review the documents you signed. Second, Thornfield's acquisition of Holloway is a sound business decision based on market analysis and growth potential." I maintained steady eye contact. "And third, my grandmother's money, as you call it, has been under my strategic management. For years, growing through investments you dismissed as cute hobbies." Victor braced his hands against the back of a chair, knuckles whitening. "So, this is what? Revenge because I fell in love with someone else?" "This is reclamation," I clarified. "Of value that was always mine, from the house you claimed as yours to the business insights you presented as your own throughout our marriage." Something in my tone must have penetrated his anger, because his expression shifted, calculation replacing pure emotion. Victor the strategist was emerging from behind Victor the affronted husband. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice lowered. "There must be a resolution that doesn't involve destroying everything I've built." "You haven't built as much as you think," I replied evenly. "The acquisition will proceed regardless of your objections. The board has already approved it." The eviction stands as well, with the legal documentation being processed as we speak. "And Melissa? Was making her homeless part of your master plan too?" I regarded him steadily. "Melissa's housing arrangements aren't my concern. The eviction applies to unauthorized occupants of my property. Her circumstances are a consequence of choices you both made." Victor straightened, adjusting his tie in a habitual gesture I recognized as his preparation for negotiation. "Let's discuss this rationally. The house? Fine. I can acknowledge I should have verified the ownership details, but the company acquisition is unnecessary. We can reach an arrangement that preserves my position at Holloway while giving Thornfield whatever financial benefits you're seeking. His pivot to negotiation was predictable. It had always been his fallback when emotional appeals failed. What he failed to grasp was that this wasn't a negotiation. It was the systematic implementation of a strategy already in motion. Your position at Holloway is not part of Thornfield's acquisition plan, I informed him. The restructuring proposal specifically eliminates the current executive suite in favor of a more collaborative leadership model. You're firing me, he translated, disbelief coloring his tone. After everything I've contributed to building that company? The board is approving a restructuring plan that doesn't include your role, I corrected. Your contributions will be noted in the transition documentation, alongside proper attribution for ideas originally sourced from others. Victor stared at me, comprehension slowly dawning. My God, you've been planning this for months, haven't you? This isn't some emotional reaction to Melissa. This is systematic. Strategic, I agreed. A quality you've always claimed to value. In business. At what point did you decide to destroy me? He asked, anger returning to his voice. When did your loving wife transform into this corporate predator? The question revealed so much about how completely he had misunderstood me throughout our marriage. I didn't decide to destroy you, Victor. I decided to stop minimizing myself to accommodate your ego. The distinction is significant. I gathered my portfolio, preparing to leave. As for timing, my investment strategy has been developing since my grandmother's passing. The specific application to Holloway became relevant when I discovered you. Were taking credit for my market insights while planning to discard me personally? I never planned to discard you, he objected. I asked for a separation, time to think. While already planning your future with Melissa, I finished for him. The emails between you made your intentions quite clear. His expression shifted again, this time to something approaching an alarm. You read my emails? That's an invasion of privacy, possibly illegal. Your attorney will advise against pursuing that angle, I interrupted calmly. The emails were accessed on a shared home computer where you had left yourself logged in. No laws were broken, merely a window opened into your actual intentions. Victor fell silent, visibly reassessing his position. After a moment, he adopted a softer tone, the one he used when trying to connect emotionally during negotiations. Sophia, whatever my mistakes, 15 years together must count for something. We built a life, shared experiences, and supported each other. Does none of that matter now? It was a calculated appeal, one I had anticipated. What surprised me was how little emotional impact it carried. 6 months ago, such words might have reached me. Now, having seen the unfiltered version of his thoughts in those emails, I recognized them as tactical rather than genuine. Our history matters in that it's brought us to this moment, I replied. But it doesn't change the path forward. The acquisition will proceed. The eviction stands. Your professional future will need to be constructed outside of Holloway Development Partners. And if I fight this, he challenged, take it public? Let everyone know how Victor Reeves's vindictive ex-wife dismantled his career over a personal grudge. That would be your choice, I acknowledged. Though I'd advise against it. The documentation supporting both the acquisition and the eviction is meticulous. A public battle would only highlight the discrepancy between your perceived ownership and the legal reality. Victor studied me, as if seeing me clearly for perhaps the first time in our 15 years together. You really have thought of everything, haven't you? Not everything, I admitted. I didn't anticipate you moving Melissa into the house quite so quickly. That demonstrated a recklessness I hadn't fully calculated into my timeline. A knock at the door interrupted our exchange. Lawrence entered, his expression professionally neutral. Ms. Martinez, the documentation is ready for your review before submission to the regulatory authorities. Thank you, Lawrence. I'll be right. There. I turned back to Victor. Our discussion is concluded. Security will escort you from the building. This isn't over, he said, the phrase sounding more reflexive than convincing. Actually, it is, I replied. The board has voted. The property documentation is clear. What remains are merely the formalities of implementation. As I left him standing in the conference room, I felt none of the vindictive satisfaction he clearly expected me to experience. Instead, there was only the quiet certainty of proper alignment, actions and consequences finding their natural equilibrium. Back in Thornfield's executive suite, the team had gathered to coordinate the next phase of our strategy. The preliminary agreement with Holloway's board had been formalized, regulatory filings were being prepared, and the market had responded enthusiastically to the acquisition announcement. Holloway's stock was up 14%, with analysts praising the strategic synergies between the companies. The media has picked up on your involvement, Imani reported, displaying several financial news headlines on the main screen. Martinez heir behind Thornfield's Holloway acquisition is trending in business circles. Any mention of the personal connection yet? I asked, reviewing the coverage. Not in the major outlets, she confirmed. Though social media is beginning to connect the dots between Sophia Martinez and Sophia Reeves. That was inevitable, I acknowledged. Our media statement should address it directly but minimally. Acknowledge the personal connection while emphasizing the business rationale for the acquisition. Already drafted, Dominic said, passing me a tablet with the prepared statement. Focused on Thornfield's historical interest in urban development properties and Holloway's portfolio alignment with that strategy. I reviewed the statement, making minor adjustments to strengthen the business case while neither denying nor emphasizing the personal element. The goal wasn't to hide my connection to Victor, but to ensure it didn't overshadow the sound investment principles behind the acquisition. Perfect, I confirmed, returning the tablet. Release this to the financial press immediately. And the eviction? Lawrence asked. I've received 3 calls from Victor's attorney in the past hour. Proceed as planned, I instructed. The documentation is being filed today, with formal enforcement to follow in accordance with legal requirements. He'll likely request an emergency hearing to contest it, Lawrence warned, which will only result in official judicial confirmation of the ownership structure, I noted. Another public record highlighting the discrepancy between his assumptions and reality. As the team dispersed to implement their respective tasks, I moved to the window wall overlooking the city. From this height, I could see both the Wellington building where Holloway's offices were located and, in the distance, the Tudor-style house that Victor had claimed as his domain. Both physical spaces that represented the professional and personal aspects of his identity, both now revealed to be built on misconceptions about ownership and control. My phone chimed with a text from an unexpected source. Melissa Winters. Is it true? Victor says you're trying to evict us from your house, that you own it completely? Please tell me if this is a misunderstanding. The message confirmed what I had suspected. Victor had not been transparent with Melissa about the rapidly evolving situation. Typical of his approach, sharing only the information that served his preferred narrative. I considered ignoring the message, but something in its tone suggested an opportunity to demonstrate contrast between Victor's communication style and my own. I typed a response. The house is legally owned by my holding company, Martina Estates LLC, and has been since its purchase 7 years ago. This is a matter of public record. The eviction notice is legally valid and will be enforced according to standard procedures. Her response came quickly. But Victor said we bought out your share when you agreed to the separation. He showed me paperwork. Interesting. Victor had apparently manufactured documents to support the narrative he was presenting to Melissa. Another deception, another manipulation of someone who trusted him. No such transaction occurred. Whatever paperwork Victor showed you was not valid. I suggest you consult an independent attorney to verify the property records. There was a longer pause before her next message. I don't understand. Why would he lie about this? We're planning our wedding. He sent out save the dates to his colleagues. I felt an unexpected twinge of sympathy for Melissa. Despite her role in the dissolution of my marriage, she appeared to be another victim of Victor's selective presentation of reality, a pattern I had experienced throughout our 15 years together. I can't speak to Victor's motivations. I can only confirm the legal reality of the property ownership. The eviction notice provides 36 hours to vacate, which I believe is reasonable given the circumstances. No further messages came from Melissa, but 20 minutes later, Victor called again. I declined the call, but his voicemail revealed a shift in his approach. Sophia, this has gone far enough. Melissa is distraught. Whatever issues are between us shouldn't affect her. She had no idea about the house ownership. If you want me out, fine, but give her reasonable time to make arrangements. This isn't who you are, this coldness, this corporate calculation. Call me back so we can discuss a humane resolution. The appeal to humanity was another predictable tactic, one that might have been more compelling had I not seen the emails where he discussed me as an asset to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Still, I wasn't interested in causing collateral damage to Melissa, despite her participation in the affair. I texted Victor. The eviction stands as legally required. However, if Melissa needs additional time to secure alternative housing, she may contact Lawrence Chen to arrange a specific extension that applies only to her, not to you. His response was immediate. Now you're trying to separate us? This is a new low, even for whatever you've become. I didn't reply. The offer had been made in good faith. How he chose to present it to Melissa was his decision. By late afternoon, the full impact of the day's developments was becoming clear in both business and personal spheres. Financial analysts were extensively covering the Thornfield Holloway acquisition, with most assessments positive about the strategic fit, despite some questions about the unusual connection between the company's leadership. We need to address the executive transition plan more explicitly, Dominic advised as we reviewed the media coverage. The market is speculating about who will lead the combined entity. Release the leadership structure we discussed, I instructed. Emphasize the collaborative model with proper attribution systems built into the corporate governance. This had been a central element of my vision for the restructured company. A leadership approach that systematically credited the source of ideas and innovations rather than allowing them to be appropriated by those with the most organizational power. It wasn't just about correcting Victor's behavior. It was about establishing a more ethical corporate culture overall. And your role specifically? Imani asked. The press will want to know if you're taking an operational position or remaining an investor. Clarify that I'll serve as executive chairperson, focusing on strategic direction while the operational leadership will be handled by a team of industry experts, including several current Holloway directors who've demonstrated ethical leadership practices. As Imani departed to prepare this announcement, my phone displayed yet another call, this time from Gerald Blackwell. Sophia, he began when I answered. I felt I should give you a heads up. Victor has approached several board members individually, attempting to build opposition to the acquisition despite our preliminary agreement. That's disappointing but not surprising, I replied. Has he gained any traction? Limited, Gerald admitted. His arguments are primarily emotional rather than financial, which isn't particularly compelling given the premium Thornfield is offering. But he's making some concerning allegations about your motivations and methods, all of which can be refuted with documentation, I assured him. Every aspect of this acquisition has been structured to withstand the highest level of scrutiny. I believe that, Gerald said, his tone suggesting genuine respect. But I thought you should be prepared for some potential turbulence at tomorrow's formal signing. I appreciate the warning, I replied. Will you be attending in person or virtually? In person, he confirmed. Some matters benefit from face-to-face interaction. After ending the call, I briefed Lawrence on this development, ensuring our legal documentation was prepared to address any last-minute objections Victor might raise. The groundwork had been meticulously laid over months. His emotional appeals weren't likely to derail the acquisition, but preparation remained essential. By evening, as the financial markets closed with Holloway's stock up 16% on news of the acquisition, I returned to my apartment to review the events of the day and prepare for tomorrow's formal signing ceremony. The systematic dismantling of Victor's professional and personal misconceptions was proceeding according to plan, each element unfolding with the precision I had carefully engineered. My phone chimed with an alert from the house security system. Multiple entry attempts using Victor's code, which I had deactivated remotely after our confrontation. The security cameras showed him standing at the front door, repeatedly trying his code before finally pounding on the door in frustration. Beside him stood Melissa, her expression a mixture of confusion and distress. I watched for a moment, not with satisfaction, but with a sense of inevitability. Actions have consequences, a principle my grandmother had emphasized throughout my upbringing. Victor was experiencing the natural outcome of choices he had made, assumptions he had held, and realities he had refused to acknowledge. Tomorrow would bring the formal signing of the acquisition agreement, the public announcement of the new leadership structure, and the legal enforcement of the eviction notice. Not revenge, not emotional retaliation, but the systematic restoration of proper alignment between actions and outcomes. As I prepared for bed, I realized I felt none of the vindictive triumph Victor likely imagined I was experiencing. Instead, there was only the quiet satisfaction of reclamation, of property, of professional recognition, and most importantly, of the narrative that had been mine all along. Morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my apartment as I reviewed the final documentation for today's signing ceremony. The acquisition agreement had been meticulously crafted, with particular attention to the leadership transition plan that would systematically reshape Holloway's corporate culture. Outside, the financial district was coming alive, unaware that by day's end, one of its established players would be fundamentally transformed. My phone rang, Imani calling with a pre-meeting update. "The press is gathering in the Wellington building. Lobby," she reported. "Financial media primarily, though several lifestyle publications have sent reporters as well, obviously hoping for drama given the personal connection." "They'll be disappointed," I replied. "The signing will proceed professionally, focusing entirely on the business rationale for the acquisition." "That's our intention," Imani agreed, "but Victor may have other ideas. Our sources indicate he was at Holloway's offices until midnight, meeting with several board members and senior executives." This wasn't unexpected. Victor had always excelled at last-minute persuasion, using his considerable charm and strategic framing to influence decisions. What he failed to grasp was that this situation wasn't amenable to his usual approach. The groundwork I'd laid over months had created a foundation too solid to be undermined by 11th-hour appeals. "Any indication he's gained support?" I asked. "Minimal." Two board members expressed concerns about the transition timeline, but the majority remained committed to the agreement as structured. I nodded, satisfied with this assessment. "And the eviction enforcement?" "The formal notice has been delivered. To the property, legal representatives will arrive at 2 p.m. to oversee the process." After concluding the call, I dressed with particular care, selecting a tailored navy suit that conveyed authority without ostentation, accented with my grandmother's emerald pendant. Today wasn't about personal triumph or vindication. It was about establishing a new corporate vision built on proper attribution and ethical leadership. As I prepared to leave, I received an unexpected call from a number I didn't recognize. I nearly declined it, assuming it might be another attempt by Victor to delay the inevitable, but something prompted me to answer. "Ms. Martinez?" a female voice began hesitantly. "This is Melissa Winters." I paused, genuinely surprised by this. Direct contact. Yes, Ms. Winters. What can I do for you? She seemed to struggle for words. I've spent the night researching everything. The property records, Thornfield's acquisition history, your grandmother's business legacy. I'm calling because I need to understand what's happening. Her approach, seeking information rather than making accusations, was not what I had expected based on Victor's characterization of her. What specifically are you trying to understand? I asked neutrally. Victor told me you're doing this out of jealousy and revenge, she said, her voice steadying. But the timeline doesn't make sense. Thornfield's interest in Holloway predates our relationship. The house ownership documentation is years old. This isn't some impulsive reaction. No, I confirmed. It isn't. Then why? She asked. Why now? Why this coordinated approach? It was a fair question, one that deserved a thoughtful response rather than dismissal. Timing in business, as in life, is about alignment of multiple factors, I explained. Thornfield's interest in Holloway reached a natural culmination point as the Wellington project completed. The property matter became relevant when unauthorized occupancy occurred. There was silence on the line before. Melissa spoke again, her voice quieter. He lied to me. About everything. The house, his position at Holloway, even how long we've been together. He told me you knew about us from the beginning, that you had agreed to an open marriage arrangement before changing your mind. The fabrication was so comprehensive, so contrary to reality, that I nearly laughed. Instead, I maintained professional composure. That was not the case, I stated simply. I'm starting to realize that, she replied. Look, I'm not calling to apologize or justify anything. I made my choices, but I'm also not going to continue being manipulated. I've packed my things and I'm leaving the house today. I thought you should know. This development was unexpected. Melissa demonstrating an independence and ethical awareness I hadn't anticipated based on Victor's portrayal of her. I appreciate your directness, I said. If you need more time to secure alternative arrangements, I don't, she interrupted firmly. I have resources of my own, contrary to how Victor has presented me. I don't need his house or his protection. After ending the call, I stood at my window for a moment, recalibrating my assessment of Melissa Winters. Victor had characterized her as young, impressionable, easily manipulated, another person he could shape to fit his narrative. That characterization appeared increasingly inaccurate. The revelation altered nothing about my strategy for today, but it provided additional context that reinforced the necessity of the corporate culture transformation I envisioned for the post-acquisition company. At precisely 9:30 a.m., I arrived at the Wellington building where the signing ceremony would take place. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Finalizing the acquisition in the very building whose renovation I had helped finance anonymously through Thornfield, the building where Victor had established his executive suite with connecting doors to Melissa's. Office at the lobby was indeed filled with media representatives, their attention immediately focusing on me as I entered with Imani, Lawrence, and Dominic. Rather than avoiding them, I approached directly, delivering a brief statement that emphasized the business rationale for the acquisition while acknowledging but not dwelling on the personal connection. Thornfield's interest in Holloway development, Partners is based on strategic synergies and growth potential, I stated clearly. While I recognize there is interest in the personal element given my previous marriage to Victor Reeves, this acquisition is fundamentally a business decision, driven by sound investment principles. The reporters called out follow-up questions, but I simply smiled professionally and continued toward the elevator, leaving Imani to handle any additional media inquiries. The narrative had been established. Business first, personal connections secondary. How Victor would approach the same media gauntlet remained to be seen. The signing ceremony was scheduled for the Holloway boardroom on the 40th floor, a space I had visited numerous times as Victor's wife during company functions. always introduced as the supportive Mrs. Reeves, rather than as a strategic thinker in my own right. Today, I would enter that same room as Sophia Martinez, executive chairperson of Thornfield Real Estate Investment Group, the entity acquiring the company Victor had believed would make him a named partner. As the elevator ascended, Lawrence briefed me on last-minute developments. Victor has requested to address the board before the signing. Gerald has granted him 10 minutes as a courtesy. An expected maneuver, I noted. His final attempt to control the narrative. Also, there's been a notable withdrawal from the property, Lawrence continued, checking his security updates. Multiple suitcases were removed about an hour ago. Female clothing primarily, according to our observers. Melissa is making good on her stated intention to leave independently. Interesting. The elevator doors opened to reveal Gerald Blackwell waiting to greet us. Sophia, he said, extending his hand. The board is assembled. Most members are present physically, with 2 joining virtually due to prior commitments. And Victor? I inquired as we walked toward the boardroom. Arrived 20 minutes ago, Gerald confirmed. He's requested a brief address before the formal signing, which I've allowed as a professional courtesy. Of course, I agreed. Transitions benefit from clear communication. As we entered the boardroom, the assembled directors turned toward us, their expressions ranging from professional neutrality to barely concealed curiosity about how the personal dynamics would manifest in this business setting. Victor sat at the far end of the table, immaculately dressed as always, though the strain of the past 24 hours showed in the tightness around his eyes. Good morning, I greeted the room collectively, taking the seat that had been prepared for me. Thank you all for accommodating this expedited time frame for what I believe will be a mutually beneficial transition. Gerald opened the meeting with formal introductions and a brief overview of the acquisition terms before turning to Victor. As requested, you have the floor for 10 minutes before we proceed to the signing. Victor stood, buttoning his suit jacket in the practiced gesture I recognized from countless presentations and negotiations. He made brief eye contact with me before addressing the room as a whole. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, I appreciate this opportunity to speak before you formalize a decision that will fundamentally alter the company I've helped build over the past decade. His voice carried the resonant authority that had served him well throughout his career, confident without arrogance, persuasive without appearing manipulative. It was a skill I had always acknowledged, even as I recognized its application to ideas that were often not originally his. The acquisition before you today is presented as a strategic business decision beneficial to all stakeholders, he continued. On paper, the financial terms are indeed generous. The premium over market value is substantial, and the liquidity benefits are real. He paused, surveying the room before continuing. However, what those terms don't reveal, what can't be quantified in financial projections, is the context in which this acquisition has been orchestrated. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing the turn toward personal matters. Sophia Martinez, Victor said, gesturing toward me, is not merely a savvy investor who identified Holloway as an undervalued asset. She is my wife, of 15 years, currently in the midst of divorce proceedings initiated after I requested a temporary separation to focus on the Wellington project. The deliberate mischaracterization was subtle but significant, presenting himself as having requested a temporary separation rather than having conducted a months-long affair with his executive assistant. I maintained a neutral expression, allowing him to continue without interruption. This acquisition, along with her sudden claim of exclusive ownership of our family home, represents not a business strategy but a personal vendetta, Victor asserted. A sophisticated form of revenge designed to dismantle not just my career, but the company many of us have built together. Gerald glanced toward me, clearly wondering if I would respond. I gave a slight shake of my head, trusting that Victor's emotional approach would undermine his credibility more effectively than any counter-argument I might offer. I'm not asking you to reject the acquisition entirely. Victor pivoted, recognizing the weakness in direct opposition to the financial benefits. I'm asking for a postponement, 30 days to develop an alternative leadership transition plan that preserves the institutional knowledge and relationships that have made Holloway successful. He was offering a compromise, a delay tactic he likely hoped would provide enough time to mount a more substantive opposition. It was a skilled approach, acknowledging the inevitable while attempting to maintain some control over the process. Thanks you for your time, he concluded, returning to his seat with the composed dignity that had been his hallmark in corporate settings. Gerald allowed a moment of silence before turning to me. Ms. Martinez, would you care to respond before we proceed to discussion and vote? I considered declining, letting the agreement stand on its merits, but recognized the opportunity to address the mischaracterizations directly and succinctly. Thank you, Gerald. I stood, maintaining eye contact with the board members rather than focusing on Victor. I'll be brief, as the acquisition documentation speaks for itself regarding the business rationale for this transaction. I paused, ensuring I had their full attention. Regarding the personal elements Mr. Reeves has introduced, I'll clarify only what's directly relevant to your decision today. The timeline is crucial here. Thornfield's interest in Holloway began over a year ago, with preliminary acquisition, analysis conducted well before any personal developments between Mr. Reeves and myself. The property ownership he referenced has been structured through my holding company since its purchase 7 years ago, a matter of public record that can be verified independently. I maintained a measured, factual tone, avoiding the emotional appeals Victor had employed. Most importantly, this acquisition is not about dismantling what's been built, but about enhancing it through a leadership model that emphasizes proper attribution and collaborative innovation. Many of you will continue to play vital roles in that vision. I concluded my response and returned to my seat, the contrast between our approaches impossible to miss, Victor's emotional appeal versus my factual clarification. Gerald thanked me before turning to the board. We'll now open the floor for questions. Before proceeding to the vote on the acquisition agreement as presented, the questions that followed were primarily technical, focused on integration timelines and retention strategies for key personnel. 2 board members referenced Victor's request for postponement, but their inquiries centered on whether a delay would affect the premium pricing rather than the personal considerations he had raised. Throughout the discussion, I provided clear, factual responses, emphasizing the comprehensive planning that had gone into the integration strategy. Victor remained silent, his expression increasingly resigned, as it became apparent that his emotional appeal had gained little traction against the financial benefits the acquisition offered. Finally, Gerald called for the vote. The motion before the board is to approve the acquisition agreement with Thornfield Real Estate Investment Group as presented, without modification or postponement. The vote was conducted by roll call, with each board member stating their position clearly. As the tally reached the required majority for approval, Victor stood abruptly and left the room without comment, a departure that caused momentary awkwardness but didn't interrupt the proceedings. The motion is approved, Gerald announced formally. We will now proceed to the signing of the acquisition agreement. The signing itself was methodical, with Lawrence guiding each party through the various documents requiring signatures. Throughout the process, I maintained the professional focus that had characterized my approach from the beginning. This was a business transaction, not a personal triumph. As the final signatures were applied, formalizing Thornfield's acquisition of Holloway Development Partners, I felt not the vindictive satisfaction Victor had attributed to me, but the measured accomplishment of a strategic objective years in the making. Congratulations, Ms. Martinez, Gerald said as we concluded the formal proceedings. I look forward to working with you during the transition and beyond. Likewise, I replied. The integration plan prioritizes retaining the ethical leadership that's been essential to Holloway's successes. As we prepared to leave the boardroom, My phone displayed a notification from the house security system. The front door had been opened using the temporary code I had provided to the legal representatives. Overseeing the eviction. The timing aligned perfectly with the scheduled 2 p.m. enforcement. Lawrence noticed my brief glance at the phone. "Everything proceeding as planned at the property?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I confirmed. "Though according to earlier reports, Ms. Winters has already removed her belongings independently. And Victor? We'll discover the reality when he returns there after leaving here." I paused, considering. "Though perhaps you should send a courtesy message confirming the enforcement. Timeline. No need for unnecessary confrontation if it can be avoided." Lawrence nodded, appreciating the practical approach that prioritized orderly implementation over emotional impact. As we descended in the elevator, Imani briefed me on the media coverage of the acquisition. Financial outlets are focusing on the business rationale, though several are noting the unusual personal connection between the company's leadership. As expected, I acknowledged. The narrative will evolve toward the strategic vision once the integration begins to demonstrate results. Outside the Wellington building, reporters again gathered, seeking comments on the completed acquisition. I provided a brief statement emphasizing the forward-looking aspects of the transition: new leadership models, emphasis on collaborative innovation, proper attribution systems being built into corporate governance. One reporter asked a more personal question. "Ms. Martinez, how does it feel to acquire the company where your ex-husband was building his career?" I paused, considering how to address this without feeding the narrative Victor had attempted to establish. "This acquisition represents a strategic alignment between Thornfield's investment approach and Holloway's development expertise," I replied. "The personal connection is incidental to the business rationale, which stands on its own merits." The reporter persisted. "But the timing, coming immediately after your separation, business opportunities unfold according to market conditions and strategic alignment, not personal timelines," I interrupted gently but firmly. "The documentation clearly demonstrates that Thornfield's interest in Holloway predated any personal developments." The measured response appeared to satisfy most of the assembled media, though I had no doubt that some publications would continue to explore the personal angle regardless of the facts. That was beyond my control and ultimately irrelevant to the implementation of the vision I had for the restructured company. As we departed in the waiting car, Dominic updated me on the market reaction to the finalized acquisition. Holloway's stock is up another 3% since the announcement. Analysts are generally positive about the strategic fit, though several have questions about the leadership transition details. We'll address those in tomorrow's investor call, I noted. The emphasis should remain on the collaborative leadership model and attribution systems being implemented. The car navigated through midday traffic toward the Thornfield offices where the integration team was already assembled to begin implementing the transition plan. Phase 1 of my strategy, reclaiming what had always been mine, was now complete. The house ownership had been legally clarified. The acquisition had been formalized. Victor's misconceptions about both his personal and professional domains had been systematically corrected. What remained was perhaps the most important element: implementing the vision for ethical leadership and proper attribution that had always been at the core of my strategy. This wasn't merely about reclaiming what Victor had appropriated. It was about establishing a corporate culture that prevented such appropriation from happening to others in the future. As we arrived at the Thornfield offices, I felt none of the vengeful triumph Victor had attributed to me. Instead, there was only the measured satisfaction of strategic implementation, of actions and consequences finding their proper alignment through methodical, purposeful steps, rather than emotional reaction. The real work was just beginning. The afternoon following the acquisition signing, I focused on the integration process with the Thornfield team, methodically addressing each element of the transition plan. The media coverage had evolved as expected. financial outlets highlighting the business rationale while tabloids attempted to frame the acquisition as a revenge plot. Neither narrative affected the implementation of our strategy. At 4:30 p.m., my phone displayed a notification from the house security system. Victor had arrived at the property, where he would find not only the locks changed, but legal representatives documenting the enforcement of the eviction notice. I considered ignoring this development, focusing instead on the corporate transition, but recognized that a direct conversation might be more efficient than allowing the situation to escalate through attorneys. I need to address a personal matter, I informed Imani, rising from the conference table where we'd been reviewing organizational charts. Continue with the department integration planning. I'll return shortly. 30 minutes later, I arrived at the Tudor house to find Victor engaged in a heated discussion with Lawrence's associate, Alexandra Thompson, on the front lawn. His Mercedes was parked haphazardly in the driveway, driver's door still open, suggesting he had arrived in haste. "This is legally indefensible," Victor was saying as I approached. "You can't lock someone out of their primary residence without court proceedings." "The court proceedings wouldn't be necessary given the clear ownership documentation," Alexandra replied calmly. "However, as a professional courtesy, we're providing access for you to collect essential personal items under supervision." Victor turned as he heard my footsteps, his expression shifting from frustration to a strange mixture of anger and disbelief. "Wasn't today enough for you?" he demanded. "The company, my career. Did you have to make us homeless on the same day?" "Not homeless," I corrected, maintaining professional distance. "Merely required to vacate property you're occupying without legal right. I believe Melissa has already removed her belongings independently." "She left this morning," he confirmed, his tone bitter. "Another casualty of your scorched earth approach. Congratulations." "Melissa made her own decisions after discovering the extent of your misrepresentations," I replied evenly. "Both regarding the house ownership and other matters." Victor stared at me, genuinely bewildered by my composure. "How did you become this person? This calculating, cold-blooded—" "I've always been this person," I interrupted. "The difference is that I'm no longer minimizing myself to accommodate your narrative. You're experiencing the natural consequences of choices you made with full agency." Alexandra cleared her throat professionally. "Mr. Reeves, we've prepared inventory forms for you to document the personal items you'll be removing today. Anything beyond essential belongings will need to be scheduled for later retrieval by appointment." Victor ignored her, maintaining his focus on me. 15 years, he said, his voice lowered. 15 years together, and you can stand there, talking about inventory forms and scheduled retrieval like we're strangers. We became strangers the moment you decided I was an asset to be managed rather than a partner to be respected, I replied. Your emails made that perspective quite clear. Something in my tone must have penetrated his anger, because his expression shifted, calculation replacing pure emotion. Victor the strategist emerging once again. "What do you actually want, Sophia?" he asked, his voice controlled now. "Not the company, not the house. What's your endgame here? There must be terms you're seeking." It was a revealing question, one that demonstrated how completely he still misunderstood the situation. In his worldview, this was a negotiation, tactic, a power play designed to secure better terms for something else. The possibility that these were simply consequences, not leverage for further demands, hadn't registered. "This isn't a negotiation strategy," I explained calmly. "The house has always been solely in my name. That's now been legally clarified. Thornfield's acquisition of Holloway was based on sound investment principles, now formally completed. There's no endgame beyond proper alignment of ownership and control." "So that's it?" Victor asked incredulously. "You dismantle my career, take our home, and walk away?" "I haven't dismantled anything," I corrected. "I've reclaimed what was legally mine and implemented a business strategy based on market analysis. Your career remains yours to construct, just not at Holloway and not in this house. Alexandra intervened again, her professional demeanor unwavering. Mr. Reeves, we need to proceed with the inventory if you wish to remove personal items today. Otherwise, we can schedule an appointment for tomorrow. Victor finally acknowledged her presence, the reality of the situation seemingly sinking in. Fine, he said tersely. Let's get this over with. As they moved toward the front door, Victor paused, turning back to me. This isn't the end, he stated, though his tone lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. You've won this round, but there will be consequences. There already have been, I replied simply, for choices we both made. The difference is that I've accepted mine. I returned to my car, leaving Alexandra to oversee the inventory process. There was no satisfaction in watching Victor confronted with the physical manifestation of his changed circumstances, only the quiet certainty that proper alignment was being restored. Back at Thornfield's offices, the integration planning continued. Well into the evening, the team had mapped out departmental transitions, retention packages for key personnel, and communication strategies for clients and partners. Throughout these discussions, I maintained focus on the core vision that had always driven my strategy, creating a corporate culture that emphasized ethical leadership and proper attribution. The organizational structure looks good, I noted, reviewing the final charts. Ensure the attribution protocols are embedded in the project management systems from day one. That's non-negotiable. As the team dispersed for the evening, Dominic lingered, studying me with the careful assessment of someone who had known me since before my marriage to Victor. You seem remarkably composed, given everything that's happened today, he observed. I considered this as I gathered my materials. Today's events weren't emotional victories or defeats, I explained. They were simply the implementation of strategies long in development. The house reclamation and the acquisition were always about proper alignment, not personal vindication. Still, he persisted, seeing Victor confronted with the consequences of his actions must have provided some satisfaction. Not satisfied, I corrected thoughtfully. Clarity. There's a difference between revenge and reclamation. One seeks to inflict pain as retribution. The other simply restores proper ownership and control. As I left the office that evening, I realized that Victor had never truly understood this distinction, a fundamental difference in our approaches that had perhaps always been present, merely awaiting the right circumstances to be revealed. 3 weeks after the acquisition and eviction, the dust had begun to settle on both the professional and personal landscapes. The integration of Holloway into Thornfield's portfolio was proceeding methodically, with the new leadership structure taking shape under the collaborative model I had envisioned. Most of Holloway's employees had transitioned smoothly, appreciating the stability the acquisition provided alongside the more equitable attribution systems being implemented. The morning began with the first quarterly review since the acquisition, a comprehensive assessment of the integration progress and financial projections. I arrived at Thornfield's offices early, reviewing the presentation materials before the executive team gathered. The market response continues to exceed projections, Dominic reported as he entered, setting his tablet beside mine. Analysts have fully pivoted from questioning the personal motivations behind the acquisition to praising the strategic synergies. As expected, I acknowledged. Results speak more convincingly than speculation. There's one development you should be aware of before the meeting, Imani added, joining us with her characteristic precision timing. Victor has accepted a position with Westridge Capital in their real estate division. This wasn't surprising. Westridge was a smaller firm with less prestigious positioning than Holloway, but solid enough to provide Victor a platform for rebuilding his career. What was notable was how quickly he had secured the position, despite the circumstances of his departure from Holloway. Good, I said simply. Professional continuity benefits everyone involved. Imani raised an eyebrow, clearly expecting a different reaction. You're genuinely pleased he's landed on his feet? I considered this as I organized my notes. I never sought to destroy Victor's career, only to reclaim what had been inappropriately attributed to him. His ability to secure a new position speaks to the skills he legitimately possesses. The quarterly review proceeded efficiently with department heads reporting on integration milestones and financial projections. The attribution system I had insisted upon was already showing positive effects. Employees at all levels were more engaged now that their contributions received proper recognition rather than being absorbed by those with more organizational power. The Wellington building tenants have all signed the new lease terms, Lawrence reported during his update. The ethics compliance addendum was particularly well received by younger firms, who see it as aligned with their corporate values. This addendum, requiring tenants to implement attribution protocols and prohibiting certain behaviors like relationships between managers and direct reports, had been a non-negotiable element of the new lease agreements. Victor's former pattern would not be repeated in buildings under Thornfield's ownership. After the meeting concluded, I remained in the conference room, reviewing notes for an upcoming investor presentation. Through the glass walls, I could see the integrated teams working together, the former division between Holloway and Thornfield employees already beginning to blur. My phone chimed with a notification from my calendar, a reminder for the final walkthrough of the Tudor house scheduled for that afternoon. After Victor had removed his personal belongings, I had commissioned a complete renovation, not from emotional desire to erase his presence, but as practical preparation for listing the property for sale. The house, while legally mine, held no sentimental value worth preserving. Ms. Martinez, my assistant called from the doorway. Gerald Blackwell is here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but says it's a matter of some importance. Interesting. Gerald had transitioned smoothly from Holloway's board chair to a senior advisory role with Thornfield, bringing valuable institutional knowledge and client relationships. His unscheduled visit suggested something beyond routine business matters. Please show him in, I replied, clearing the conference table of meeting materials. Gerald entered moments later, his bearing as dignified as always, though there was a certain hesitancy in his approach that I hadn't observed before. Sophia, he began, accepting my gesture to take a seat. Thank you for seeing me without notice. I wouldn't intrude if the matter weren't significant. Of course, I assured him. What's on your mind? Victor contacted me this morning, he said, directly. He's requested a meeting with you, neutral territory, his words, to discuss what he termed unresolved matters. I hadn't expected this development. In the weeks since the eviction confrontation, Victor had communicated only through attorneys regarding final property arrangements. This direct outreach through Gerald suggested a different approach. Did he specify the nature of these unresolved matters? I asked, maintaining a neutral expression. Not explicitly, Gerald admitted, though he mentioned documentation that might be mutually concerning if it became public. Ah, this sounded like an attempted leverage play, suggesting he possessed information that could damage both our reputations if revealed. Classic Victor, attempting to regain control through implied threats rather than direct engagement. I see, I responded, considering the implications. And you agreed to convey this request because Gerald shifted slightly, professional discomfort evident in his posture. Frankly, because I thought you should be aware of his approach. The implied threat concerned me, given your role leading the merged organization. I appreciate your discretion, I said sincerely. Did Victor suggest a specific time and place for this meeting? Tomorrow, 7 p.m., at Azure, the restaurant on the 50th floor of the Citadel building. Azure, where Victor had proposed 15 years earlier. The choice wasn't arbitrary, it was calculated to evoke emotional memories that might make me more receptive to whatever he was planning to present. Another predictable tactic. I took a moment to weigh the potential benefits and risks of such a meeting. Refusing would be the simpler option, directing any legitimate concerns through proper legal channels. Yet there was value in understanding exactly what Victor believed constituted leverage at this stage. Please inform Victor I'll meet him as requested, I decided, though I'll be bringing Lawrence Chen as legal counsel, given the implied nature of the discussion. Gerald nodded, relief evident in his expression. I thought you might prefer to know about this approach directly, rather than having it come through other channels. Your discretion is appreciated, I assured him, and your loyalty to the organization is noted. After Gerald departed, I contacted Lawrence to brief him on the development and arrange for his attendance at tomorrow's meeting. His assessment aligned with mine. This was likely an attempted negotiation strategy rather than a genuine revelation of new information. We've been meticulous in our documentation, Lawrence reminded me. Any legitimate concerns would have surfaced during the acquisition due diligence or divorce proceedings. Agreed, I replied. Still, understanding Victor's current perception of leverage will be informative. The remainder of the day proceeded with the disciplined focus that had characterized my approach throughout this process. The afternoon house walkthrough confirmed the renovation was complete, transforming the Tudor property into a showcase that would appeal to high-end buyers without carrying any visible reminders of its previous occupants. As evening approached, I found myself on the balcony of my downtown apartment, watching the city transition from workday bustle to nighttime illumination. In the distance, I could see the Wellington building where both Holloway and Thornfield now operated as a unified entity. Closer, the Citadel building where tomorrow's meeting with Victor would take place. My phone chimed with an unexpected message from Melissa Winters. I hope this isn't inappropriate, but I wanted to let you know I've accepted a position with Callahan Global in their Paris office. Starting fresh. Thank you for your directness during a difficult time. It helped clarify things that needed clarity. The message was surprising not in its content, but in its existence. Melissa reaching out when there was no practical need to do so. I composed a brief, professional response. Congratulations on the position. Paris offers excellent professional opportunities. Clarity benefits everyone involved, even when initially uncomfortable. I wish you success in your new role. The exchange, brief as it was, reinforced my assessment that Melissa had been more than the one-dimensional character in Victor's narrative. Like many caught in his orbit, she had been presented with a selective version of reality that served his purposes, only to discover the fuller picture when circumstances shifted. The following evening, I arrived at Azure precisely at 7 p.m., Lawrence beside me as we were escorted to a private dining alcove overlooking the city. Victor was already seated, a glass of scotch before him, his expression shifting from practiced confidence to momentary surprise at seeing Lawrence accompany me. I didn't realize this would be a legal meeting, he commented as we approached. I had hoped for a more personal conversation. Given your reference to potentially concerning documentation, professional representation seemed prudent, I replied, taking the seat across from him. Lawrence is here to ensure any legitimate issues can be addressed appropriately. Victor studied me for a moment, clearly reassessing his approach. You look well, he finally said, his tone softening. The chairperson role clearly agrees with you. Thank you, I responded neutrally. I understand you've accepted a position with Westridge Capital, a solid firm with growth potential. He nodded, a flicker of something, perhaps genuine appreciation for the professional acknowledgement, crossing his features. Not Holloway, obviously, but a platform to rebuild. Lawrence, ever the efficient attorney, brought the conversation to its purpose. Gerald mentioned documentation of mutual concern. Perhaps we should address that directly. Victor took a measured sip of his scotch before responding. I've had considerable time to reflect on these past weeks, on my choices, on the consequences of those choices, and on the larger patterns that brought us to this point. This philosophical opening wasn't what I had expected based on Gerald's description of implied threats. I remained silent, waiting for him to continue. During my departure from the house, I discovered something I believe belongs to you, he continued, reaching into his suit jacket to withdraw a small leather portfolio. Your grandmother's original investment journal from 1985. It was in the library safe behind the false panel of rare books. He placed the portfolio on the table between us. I recognized it immediately. A handwritten record of Isabella Martinez's earliest investments, including her strategies and market analyses. I had searched for it after her passing, assuming it was lost during one of our moves. I found it years ago while looking for our insurance documents, Victor explained. I read it, studied it. The insights it contained informed several of my most successful investment strategies at Holloway. The admission was surprisingly candid, acknowledging directly what I had long suspected about the source of certain approaches he had claimed as his own innovations. Those strategies brought considerable success to Holloway, I noted, neither accusatory nor forgiving, simply stating facts. They did, he agreed, and I took full credit for them, presenting them as my original thinking rather than adaptations of your grandmother's methodologies. Lawrence shifted beside me, clearly surprised by this unprompted admission of intellectual appropriation. That journal represents the foundation of my actual threat, Victor continued, his tone shifting to something I hadn't heard from him before, something approaching genuine self-reflection. Not blackmail or leverage, but the recognition that I've built a career partly on uncredited ideas. First your grandmother's, then yours. I studied him carefully, trying to discern if this apparent insight was genuine or another calculated performance. Why bring this to me now? What purpose does this admission serve? Because I owe you that much honesty at least, he replied. The journal is rightfully yours, as was the house, as were many of the insights I claimed at Holloway. That recognition doesn't change our current circumstances, but perhaps it avoids perpetuating a false narrative. I reached for the portfolio, feeling the worn leather beneath my fingers. Thank you for returning this. It has significant personal value. Victor nodded, then continued with unexpected directness. I've also prepared a formal letter acknowledging the true origins of several key investment strategies I implemented at Holloway. Not for public distribution, but for your records and perhaps for historical accuracy within the company archives. He placed a sealed envelope beside the portfolio. This isn't an attempt to regain position or influence. It's professional restitution, I suppose. Lawrence and I exchanged glances, both clearly assessing whether this apparent accountability represented genuine recognition or strategic positioning for some future maneuver. Professional restitution, I repeated thoughtfully. An interesting concept. Melissa helped clarify certain things for me, Victor admitted, finishing his scotch. Before she left for Paris, her perspective as someone who had been both beneficiary and victim of my selective narratives was illuminating. This revelation suggested a depth of reflection I wouldn't have anticipated from Victor, whose pattern had always been to move forward rather than examining past choices with genuine introspection. I appreciate both the return of the journal and the acknowledgement, I said carefully. Though I confess this isn't the meeting I expected based on Gerald's description. Victor actually smiled slightly, a self-deprecating expression I'd rarely seen from him. I may have implied more dramatic content to ensure the meeting would happen. Old habits of manipulation die hard, it seems. He paused, studying me with unexpected directness. I underestimated you, consistently, fundamentally. Not just your strategic capacity, but your patience and methodical approach. I constructed a narrative where you existed primarily as support for my ambitions, and never bothered to question that framework even as evidence contradicted it repeatedly. The acknowledgement was surprisingly comprehensive, lacking the qualifications or deflections that had characterized most of Victor's previous attempts at accountability. That narrative wasn't entirely your creation, I noted, fair in my assessment. I allowed it to persist, presenting only those aspects of myself that fit within its parameters. We both participated in that construction. Victor nodded slowly, accepting this shared responsibility. Still, when the evidence contradicted the narrative, when your investment insights repeatedly proved more accurate than conventional wisdom, when your network connections facilitated opportunities, I chose to incorporate those benefits while maintaining the framework that minimized their source. Lawrence, ever the pragmatist, steered the conversation toward conclusion. Is there anything else regarding documentation or professional matters that needs addressing this evening? No, Victor confirmed. The journal and the acknowledgement letter represent the sum of my purpose here. He hesitated briefly before adding, though I would appreciate your discretion regarding my position at Westridge. Not legal protection, just professional courtesy. I considered this request carefully. There was no benefit in impeding Victor's career reconstruction at Westridge. The reclamation I had sought had been achieved through the acquisition and proper attribution systems, not through preventing his professional continuity. Your position at Westridge is your own to develop, I assured him. Provided attribution protocols are respected moving forward, there's no reason for interference. Relief visibly crossed his features. Thank you. As we prepared to leave, Victor spoke once more, his tone carrying a finality that suggested genuine acceptance rather than temporary concession. This is actually the end, isn't it? Not just of our marriage, but of the interdependent narratives we constructed. I nodded, recognizing the accuracy of his observation. Yes, new narratives begin for both of us, independently authored. Outside Azure, as Lawrence departed to retrieve his car, I stood for a moment looking out over the city that had been the backdrop for this chapter of my life. The Wellington building glowed with purpose in the distance, its renovated facade representing the transformation that had occurred within its corporate structure. Closer, my apartment building rose against the night sky, its upper floors illuminated with the warm light of homes rather than the fluorescent efficiency of offices. My phone chimed with a message from Imani, the investor's reaction to our quarterly. Projections had been overwhelmingly positive, with particular praise for the attribution systems that were already enhancing innovation throughout the organization. Not personal vindication, but professional validation of the vision I had implemented. As I departed in my waiting car, I felt none of the emotional turmoil that conventional wisdom might attribute to such significant life transitions. Instead, there was the quiet certainty of proper alignment, of professional recognition, of personal agency, of narratives now accurately authored rather than selectively edited to serve others' purposes. Victor had moved his mistress into what he believed was our home, never realizing it had always been solely mine, legally, financially, and now practically as well. That miscalculation had been merely the most visible manifestation of a larger pattern of misconception about ownership and attribution that had characterized our 15 years together. The correction of those misconceptions hadn't been driven by emotional vengeance or personal retribution, but by the systematic implementation of proper alignment between actions and consequences, between contributions and recognition. The house, the company, even the investment strategies, all had found their rightful attribution through methodical reclamation rather than dramatic confrontation. As the car moved through the evening traffic toward my apartment, I opened my grandmother's investment journal, feeling the familiar texture of the pages beneath my fingers. Her handwritten insights, the foundation upon which I had built my own strategic approach, had found their way back to me, completing a circle of knowledge and legacy that extended far beyond the circumstances of my marriage's dissolution. Tomorrow would bring new strategies to implement, new systems to refine, new opportunities to develop, not as Sophia Reeves, supporting character in Victor's narrative, but as Sophia Martinez, architect of her own strategic vision, a vision built on proper attribution, ethical leadership, and the fundamental understanding that reclamation is not about destruction, but about restoration of what always should have been. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.